Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Wednesday the 8th. And I'm sorry I wasn't feeling well on Monday and canceled class, but I hope that gave you an opportunity to finish up with Dracula, the longest text of the semester. In terms of paper number 1, I am in the midst of grading all of your papers, and I anticipate that I should be done with them all by next week. So if you haven't received your paper back yet, you should shortly. So you know you all have the option of doing a revision once I've returned the paper to you. And it's quite possible that you may not be able to read my handwriting. And if that is indeed the case, please let me know, and I will be happy to decipher for you. But basically, I'm reviewing those papers for grammar, mechanics, and content. And then what I'm doing is I'm putting some summary comments and a grade on them. And as long as your grade is under an A, because you can't get higher than an A, so an A minus or lower, you have the option of revising your paper. I just ask that you hand in the original with my comments along with your revision. You can send that to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And you have up until the ending of the semester in which to do so. And I will be talking a little bit more about paper number 2 over the next few classes, which will be very similar to paper number 1 with the same prompt. The distinction being that you can write about some of the later texts of the semester, and I suspect that that would include Dracula, moving to our last text of the semester. And of course, you can create your own paper topic. You just need to have that paper topic approved by me, and it has to be about one of the texts that we have read over the course of the semester. And I hope you enjoyed the Halloween class in terms of thinking about some of the ways that Halloween is celebrated. And I also utilized the day as an opportunity to talk about the English ghost story, very famous story, The Monkey's Paw. If you know Stephen King's Pet Sematary, it's based on Monkey's Paw. So Stephen King was well aware of all of these texts, but of course he would put his own spin onto things. And in fact, that's how we are ending this semester, is reading some of Stephen King's works. And I think even though we're reading just a couple of his short stories, I think that you will very clearly and quickly identify what works he has been referencing in those texts. By the time we get to the ending of the semester, which is one of the reasons why I put the semester in a chronological basis, so that you could see the text building on one another, so that by the ending of the semester, we've got a firm Gothic tradition in place. So in terms of Dracula, we were talking about the idea of how brilliant Dracula is in some respects, because ultimately it appeals to different audiences who might be interested in different genres. So if you're interested in the supernatural, obviously the first few chapters where we learn about the vampire will be of great interest to you. If you're more interested in romance, then the chapters that follow, when we find out about Lucy and Mina and their respective suitors, would probably be of interest to you. If you are interested in mysteries, and keep in mind that Edgar Allan Poe is credited with creating the modern Mystery Day story, then you are probably interested in chapters 18 through 23, which is what I call book 3, in the way that I divide up Dracula into separate books. And chapter 17, we see Mina as a researcher who's compiling evidence. And they basically get to know one another through technology. And as much as things change, they remain the same. It strikes me how we use technology today through social media, for instance, in order to maintain relationships. Though at that time, it would have been through journal entries, and it would have been through newspaper clippings and so forth. A quote, and we'll talk more about quotes next class, but one quote that I wanted to draw your attention to in chapter 17 is when Mina says that we women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters. It's a really interesting portrayal of female in this particular text. In some ways, we have some rather modern female in the sense that Mina definitely is a researcher and has embraced technology, but in other ways Mina is very traditional in the sense that she sees herself as supporting her spouse. Lucy is primarily concerned with romance and romantic relationships, which would have been considered appropriate and expected during the time period. And yet, Lucy is contemplating three suitors at the same time, and it doesn't escape me that Lucy is the character who ultimately is killed in Dracula. Because perhaps she could be seen as kind of loose or sexually promiscuous, or at least in terms of Victorian standards, where it would seem very it would seem to go very much against the conception of society to walk with one's husband hand in hand, which is something that Mina does, and she talks about how she feels so subversive in so many ways by doing something like that publicly. And I talked about the sexual elements of the text, which for the Victorian period would have been, I suppose, probably the raciest material that they could read and justify it by saying that they weren't reading racy material, that they were reading basically a vampire tale. But of course, the vampire legend is rife with the idea of sexuality. Bela Lugosi helped to bring that about with the idea of seduction. But certainly we see this with the idea of the vampire by penetrating the female. Oftentimes victims are females. We see this with the stake, which can kill a vampire, which can be seen as a phallic symbol. Vampires have oftentimes also been viewed as metaphors or symbols for the spread of communicable diseases, especially those through bodily fluids. Not that AIDS would have been on people's radar during that time period. Think something like tuberculosis, for instance. Or certainly, we could think about Dracula as a representation of the rich aristocrat who is living off of the life forces of the populace. And certainly, I think that's an image that we see in Bela Lugosi's Dracula from the 1930s, which would have been grappling with the Great Depression. But even not, if you wanted to just think about the vampire novel as a whole, it's a wonderful opportunity to view the vampire from a symbolic perspective. Um, just from a emotional standpoint, the psychic vampire that or emotional vampire that lives off of the emotions or life forces of others, basically draining them. So lots of different ways to see the vampire myth. In chapter 18, we get reference to the scriptural phrase, for the blood is the life. Obviously, Christianity is seen as savior in this particular text, as we oftentimes see in Gothic texts. Anything that is considered non-Christian is considered alien or other. And we've talked about this in terms of location as well, that anything that is, let's say, exotic, Transylvania is a good example, would be seen as other. Another way of viewing the vampire is that we have foreign invasion, kind of reverse capitalism, a reverse imperialism, if you will. And that foreign invasion is corrupting, in particular, the female through bloodlines. And the consequences of that is the dilution of basically the bloodline and societal structure that exists in Britain, in the West, which is portrayed as superior. But don't be at all surprised to see lots of Christian iconography in this particular text and Christian phrases, such as the blood is the life. In Christianity, the blood is supposed to be representational of life and life force. Jesus, in this particular instance, we could think about that vampire as sort of the anti-Jesus. and the three female vampires in the beginning of the novel who attack Jonathan, they could be seen as the anti-Trinity. Notice that three is such an important part of Christianity, and oftentimes we see three repeated throughout the novel. Again, no mistake, and no coincidence. Van Helsing makes an interesting point about Mina, that basically she's the ideal woman because she has a man's brain. That says a lot about the conception of gender and intellect at the time, and a woman's heart. Of course, Van Helsing is a foreigner, but he is basically embraced by the community, and we know that Van Helsing is able to also merge science with religion. So that ultimately Van Helsing is a power or force of good, as opposed to Dracula, which is a power or force for evil. Now, pages 243 to 246, and we'll talk a little bit more, as I said, about quotation next class. We get a long list of vampire lore that has become, in our society, popular knowledge. But understand that it wasn't always popular knowledge. So a lot of that was established in those pages about what a vampire is and what a vampire's weaknesses are. At one point, we're told in chapter 18 that Quincy, who happens to be an American, so he is a foreigner, and spoiler alert here, Quincy dies, and it strikes me as not surprising that it's the American and not one of the British who die, because the American would be seen as foreigner. Quincy had shot a vampire bat. A little bit of foreshadowing here. The vampire bat and the way that a vampire bat might be similar to the conception of the supernatural vampire, but also illustrating that Quincy and Americans tend to be rather rash, and there will be consequences to that. Chapter 19 is set in October. This is where we get the climax, and of course October is when we have Halloween, which we just celebrated, so the idea of setting is so important in Gothic novel. Renfield moves from consuming flies to spiders, so he's moving up the food chain at this particular point. And what the men do in chapter 19 is isolate Mina. We know certainly from just the few Gothic texts we've read, isolation is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. It's community that ultimately is the way to save oneself and others. So it's not surprising that Mina becomes basically a target once she's isolated. Chapter 20. Dracula is becoming suspicious at this point, and then he attacks Renfield. Up until this point, it's been mostly female victims. Chapter 21, Quincy rashly chases the vampire. Again, we talked about him shooting a vampire bat and how rash that was. And Mina, in a kind of role reversal, is drinking Dracula's blood. It's a plot device so that she can read Dracula's mind, but again, we know that drinking blood is supposed to be reminiscent of the idea of intercourse. So there's a lot of sexual imagery here. And whether that be literal intercourse or it could also be oral intercourse, because we had talked about how those three vampire bats or three vampire women at the beginning of the novel are as they attack Jonathan, it seems very much an episode of oral sex. And then finally, we get what I call book 4 of Dracula, chapters 22 to 27, where we get an adventure novel, in effect. This is where in chapter 22, Jonathan vows to join Mina as a vampire, if necessary, to illustrate his love and his loyalty to her. Chapter 23, we get some more puns. There's more at stake. You know, the idea of stake, and we've seen this over and over again in the novel. Chapter 24, when Mina says, "You men are brave and strong, but I may be of service." And of course, it's when they include Mina that they're able to defeat the vampire. Chapter 25, where we find out that the Count is a criminal and a criminal type. At the time, it was thought that actually criminals had physical features that would determine their criminality. Chapter 26, it's a minor point, but I can't help but notice it. Quincy Morris has to stay behind with Mina because he's the only one who doesn't speak foreign languages. And I don't know if you've ever heard the old joke about foreign language. What do you call somebody who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call somebody who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call somebody who speaks 1 language? American. And the idea that all of the other characters are able to speak multiple languages, but the American cannot. So he has to stay behind. Quincy dies as hero, saving Mina, but of course, in the world of the Gothic, characters who die oftentimes are, in one way or another, atoning for their sins. And we do get a happy ending. Jonathan and Mina end up having a son. Notice how different this is from the film, that's born on the anniversary of Quincy's death, no less. But they do acknowledge, all of the characters at the end, that there is ambiguity, that there are no real authentic documents about what's occurred. Oh, there are newspaper clippings and journal entries and telegrams and so forth and so on, but there's no definitive proof. So we know that the Gothic oftentimes will end in an ambiguous note, so that if you don't want to embrace a supernatural ending, you can always perhaps find a more naturalistic one. So in the notes below, in the 3rd section, you'll see I've included Dracula Daily, which I have mentioned to you previously, that this is a way that you can get a daily post for the entire novel of Dracula, so that you can read it in real time over the course of a year. Obviously, that's not something you'll be able to do for our particular class, but if you're curious in revisiting Dracula and doing it on a daily basis, that's the way that you can do it. Next class, we'll talk a little bit about quotations with Dracula and Lovecraft. You remember we began the semester with Stephen King and Lovecraft, as both of them highly respected in the Gothic tradition, and both of them writing texts about supernatural or horror literature. And Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, probably one of the most famous. It certainly influenced Stephen King. And I wanted to revisit that in the context of Lovecraft's own writing, and whether Lovecraft lives up to what he talks about in terms of what makes a good piece of supernatural horror. And I've selected just 3 of his short stories, so next class we'll talk about Lovecraft. One is entitled The Outsider, the other is entitled Pickman's Model, and the third is entitled Dunwich Horror. And I've got the corresponding page numbers for the text that I would have ordered for the class, but I've also been able to find links for free online, so I've included those. Lovecraft wrote lots of short stories, so I ordered a text that included these short stories. It has other short stories. You don't have to read those other short stories if you ordered the text for the class, but certainly you are encouraged to. Just like with the text that I had ordered for the class about great ghost stories, I obviously had a plan for Halloween to talk about The Monkey's Paw, and I had you listen to it, so that was your, quote, reading of it, quote unquote, so to speak. And certainly The Monkey's Paw is also an option for a paper, if you so decided to do so, because that is one of the texts of the semester. But that said, there are other ghost stories in that Dover edition of English Ghost Stories that you might want to refer to, but you're not required to. What you are going to be required to read, in addition to Lovecraft, is sort of our transitional work to get into more contemporary pieces. And that would be The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. You might have heard of Shirley Jackson. She wrote a very famous short story entitled The Lottery. And I tell you all this because at this point in the semester, you should be done with Dracula. If you haven't finished Dracula, this is the time to do so that you are ready to read and consider Lovecraft in our next class. And I give you The Haunting of Hill House as well, which is a novel, so it's not a short story, it's a little bit longer, but it is certainly not as long as Dracula. In terms of our next class, it should be Monday the 11th, but that is Veterans Day, so there are no classes. So I will be posting during that class that there are no classes. This will be a wonderful time to not only finish Dracula if you haven't already done so, but read Lovecraft and The Haunting of Hill House. And you can see that I have also included here a handout, well, for you it would be a posting, of my horror film and media and popular culture class, CMN 201, where we focus on film. We talk a little bit about novels, but it's about analyzing film in depth. And you can see the films that we are viewing, some of them actually might be familiar because of this class. For instance, Dracula. But we begin with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and each film represents a decade, actually. So Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is from the 1920s, Dracula is from the 1930s, Cat People, 1940s, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the 50s, Psycho, I have two films from the 60s, the first being Psycho, the second of Night of the Living Dead, the 70s, The Exorcist, 80s, Halloween, 90s, The Blair Witch Project, 2000s, 28 Days Later, and 2010s, Get Out. So if you think you might be interested in that class and you have questions, please let me know. But if you are a fan of Gothic literature, this might be a class that is of interest to you that you could use as an elective. Again, that's CMN 201. So I leave you with an optional video that you could watch if you so wanted to, not that you're required to. Actually, what I think I'll do is I'll save it for next class when we're talking about Dracula and so forth. And I hope it amuses and it entertains. I did my own little parody of not The Monkey's Paw, but of The Raven, a very famous text by Edgar Allan Poe. So since next class we probably aren't going to be going as long as this particular class, then I will save the video for next class, because as far as I'm concerned, it's still Halloween, even though retail says it's Christmas. So I hope you're doing well, I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.